Today I'm going to be using these watercolours from Viviva Colours for the first time, and I would like to start by saying a very big thank you to Viviva for inviting me to be an ambassador for them. This set is the spring range of 16 colours in a cork palette. As I haven't used these paints before, I thought we'd do a very simple little watercolour of a pepper and use them wet on dry. The wet on dry method of watercolour painting is really suitable for beginners to get to know your materials and build up your confidence before you start working wet in wet. So to begin with, we'll have a look at what's in the set. So like I say, it's 16 colours and it's the spring set, and that's all your colours there. We'll just have a quick look at the box. So vibrant and eco-friendly, which is nice, and it's got all about the story there and really the main thing was that they wanted their items to be very portable and very handy and usable. So let's have a look inside, and I have to say I really do like the packaging and everything of these. I think it's really cheerful and pretty. So super vivid and transparent colours. So they slide out of there, so we've got this handy box to keep them in, and the first thing you'll notice is they come with a little colour card that you can fill in. So before I do anything else, I'm going to put them all on here. I'm just going to lift that up and see if it focuses on there, but it's got all the colours written down, so once we've put the colours on there we'll have that to refer back to, so that's really handy. Like I said, I like the packaging and the marketing of these. Look at that little bear popping over there, so you can pop your name on there, so when you're out and about with your colours you know who they belong to, particularly if you're taking them to college or something like that. And then creativity takes courage, Henri Matisse there, so a nice little art quote as well. So this side is for mixing your colours and using like a palette. You don't have to do that, that's handy if you're out and about, but of course if you're at home you might want to just use an ordinary palette. And the container itself is actually made of cork, and then you've got all your colours there. So before we go on to doing that, trying them out using that pepper for a little still life painting, I'm just going to stop a moment and fill all these colours in so that I can keep this for future reference. Okay, so the first thing to say is they are really nice bright colours, and also I got plenty of colour off just with one little sweep of the brush there. So these pans will probably last quite a long time because you've got plenty of paint there. Some are more transparent than others. Obviously it's not an exact science. I didn't have exactly the same amount of water on my brush each time, although I tried to keep it pretty similar. Some of them seem much more opaque than others, so the Crimson Lake and the Cobalt Blue, you can see they've got quite a thick cover, and the Viridium. Some of these colours you'll be familiar with, like the alizarin crimson, we've got there Viridian, Cobalt, Turquoise Blue. Some of them have got slightly different names that we may not have come across before, so this is a rather nice one, Cocktail Pink, and another one, Cinnamon, that's rather nice, this one here. So some really nice names actually. This one's Opera, that's a nice one as well. You can see why they've called it a spring mix. We've got lots of nice bright colours there, but also I do think you could make some quite nice skin tones out of these. So if you're interested in doing portrait paintings, you could use one or two of these, especially these ones here, for some skin tones. Okay, so I'll go ahead now and have a go at doing this pepper. So I'm probably going to be using more of the yellows, oranges and reds. Like we've got quite a few of these up here. Got a couple of pinks there, a couple of reds. So we've got a nice mix all together, with the three blues. So you should be able to mix plenty of colours from this little set. So you can see I've done a very simple drawing, just the outline of the pepper. You could do this with an apple or something else. It doesn't have to be a pepper, just something that's got some nice bright colours in that you can have a practice with. So to begin with, I'm going to use the yellow and I'm going to put it all over except for a few places where the highlights are. So the centre of here is a bit more of a creamy white colour, so we'll leave that, and we'll also leave some highlights on the top here where the light is hitting the pepper, because obviously it's a very flat shiny surface, so it does reflect the light. So the yellow that we're using is this one here, and it's called Bees Yellow, and you can see why that's called Bees Yellow, that lovely bright yellow there. So I've just mixed some in the palette with plenty of water, and I'm going to cover that over like I say, leaving some dry paper for the highlights and for that centre there. But I will cover over this part here because that's going to be green. So having the yellow underneath is just going to brighten that up and give it an extra layer and put the layers on top of each other to build up that intensity of colour. So we need to have a think about where we're going to leave these highlights, where it's the absolute brightest. And you don't want to overdo it with highlights, don't leave too many. So it's catching the light on the top here. So if we go like that, we'll leave that little bit there white and that little bit there. And that helps build the shape of the pepper as well. So just one or two bits of highlight there. And of course you can always go over those later. It doesn't have to be set in stone with your highlights. You can always put some watercolour over them later on if you've decided you've got too many or if they're in the wrong place. Excuse me, my voice is going. So you can see we're getting a lovely covering with these watercolours. Really lovely bright yellow. And what we'll do is we'll leave it to completely dry before we come back and put some more colour on there. And we'll also talk a bit later on about what shadow colours we'll use for underneath, because when you're doing a still life you always want to get some nice shadows underneath to make it look as if it's sat on the table. So just moving it around a little bit, we don't want any pools of colour. Got quite a lot of water on there. This is quite a good paper though, so it should be absolutely fine with this amount of water. I've got a little bit of cotton or something there, I don't know if that's off my jumper. And we'll leave that to completely dry. You can see that's almost dry, it's just a couple of bits around here that are still not quite dry. And it's dried really lovely and evenly, so there's no pooling, there's no cauliflowers. Despite the fact that we put plenty of water in there, it's given a nice even coverage, and it's a lovely bright vibrant base to start and work off. So really nice so far with these paints. So before we go on, we'll have a little look at this pepper, and you can see we've got light and dark bits in this green that we've got here. So what I'm going to do, if we look at the chart here, and this is a good thing when you're working wet and dry and you're waiting for things to dry, you can have a little bit of a think about where you're going next. So if we look at the chart, perhaps we want to use the light green, so it's a light yellow green, to do the lighter colours of that green part, and then we'll let that dry and come on with some darker green, perhaps with the permanent green, and we might add a little touch of red to that. So to begin with, I'm just going to use straight from the pan some of this light yellow green to cover all of this central area. The brush that I'm using is a size 6 with a nice tip on it to get into those shapes there that we've got. So we're going over that yellow that's now dry and over all of that central part there with that green. Nice and thick straight from the pan, not mixing that in the palette. So it doesn't show up too much, but that's going to be the lighter parts, and we're going to come on top of that with the detail with some darker colours a little bit later on. But you can already see the difference, although that's the same colour all the way across there, the difference between the area with the yellow underneath and the area that is just that nice green there. In fact, whilst that's still wet, I'm just going to lightly lift a little bit of that out, just to make that light area there where the stem has snapped off. It might have been nice actually to paint it with the stem still on if we'd had it. So as this yellow isn't quite dry, I don't want to go over this part yet, but what I will do is start thinking about the shadow maybe. So most of this pepper is red orange, so if we think about what's on the opposite side of the colour wheel, we can use that to create the shadow colours. So on the opposite side of the colour wheel to orange we have blue. So let's try mixing up a shadow colour here with some of the orange and a touch of blue. So let's have a think about which blue we want to put in. To make it a little bit on the darker side, we'll go with this cobalt, I think. It's a touch muddy, it's like a brown colour. Put a little bit more orange in. And let's have a see if that makes a nice shadow underneath that pepper. So have a look. There's lots of light sources from above, so you might get more than one shadow, but to begin with we're going to keep it try and keep it quite simple. We'll just start with one shadow and then we can always come over later making it a little bit darker. Load your brush up and make that shadow shape. And that's a nice warm colour because we've got that orange there. So it's keeping it warm, keeping it a cheerful picture, nothing too dull and muddy. And quite a crisp, defined outline, because shadows often are, aren't they? And you've got that very direct light from above there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is leave that to dry, as well as that green that we've just put on. And the light outside now is actually becoming quite dark, so I'm going to leave this to dry overnight and come back to it in the morning. And then we'll start with those oranges and reds and build it up and build the intensity of colour, because that yellow will still be coming through these transparent colours, and making it a much, I'm trying to think of the word, making it a much more tangible object, making it more 3D as we build up the layers and the shadows. As you can see, because that's been left overnight, it's completely dry now, so we can go on with some more layers. There's a little bit of cauliflower in here. That's entirely my fault, because this page was curling up a little bit because I got a lot of water on there. So I've popped a bit of tape over the edge of the paper to keep that nice and flat, and because I've still got this shadow colour on my palette here, I'm just going to add some water to that, and I'm going to make another shadow on top of the one that we've got there. Because like I said, we've got different light sources. So you could have a light coming from this direction, another from above, and you would often have overlapping shadows. So I'm just going to overlap the shadow very carefully. Actually, it goes a lot further back than that. Let's make it go further back. Right up to the edge of the yellow. And if you look closely, you can see that there's quite a crisp line around the edge of this shadow where these paints have separated slightly, granulated a little bit. That's obviously because we've got two different colours in there, and the two that granulate slightly with each other, and it can actually be quite nice. Can you see this nice crisp edge to the shadow? Okay, so we've got those two shadows. One thing you'll notice is that even though I've left it overnight, we've still got that very vibrant yellow. So it's completely dry and it's maintained its brightness. While that shadow's drying, I'm going to go on again with this nice green. This was the light yellow green, and do a little bit of detail onto here, straight from the palette there. So not adding too much water, a nice strong colour. Just starting to build up some of these shapes on here. And for some of the other detail, I'm going to make a slightly darker green. Let's have a look at this one. So this was the olive green, and it looks much darker on the palette than it does when we put it in there. And actually that's quite a nice colour for some of these details. It's just where the stem's been pulled off and left some little shapes and things here, so just an indication of those. And then I'm going to put some of the detail in this part where we went over before with the green. And then when that's dry, we'll come on with a slightly brighter green as well. So I'm not being too over fussy about the accuracy of the drawing here. It's just giving an indication of that light and shade on that part that goes around there. Don't know what you call it. It's just where the stem's been attached. And we'll come back and do more with that later, with more layers of colour. Now we need to start and build up some of the colours on the pepper itself, and I'm going to go with this orange. A little bit more water, because we're going to need quite a bit of this. And perhaps leave some areas where we can see more of the yellow. So allow some of the yellow to shine through and allow those highlights to stay there. So when we began by leaving the white highlights, leaving the paper dry, and we're doing exactly the same thing on top of the yellow, leaving some areas where we think it's going to be more yellow. Once again, we need to leave that to dry completely, and just want to say at this stage what brilliant bright colours they are. So we've got that yellow shining through the orange because obviously they're transparent, so you're still going to get that lovely warmth of the yellow coming through this pepper. Even when we go on and put the reds on top, it's building up that intensity of colour, but also the warmth and the feel of the pepper, and those nice shiny highlights to give us that feel of the smooth skin of the pepper as well. And we will have to come back later on and get some darker shadows in as well, particularly in here and right under here, again to make it pop out and make it feel more 3D. But for now we're just going to let that dry. Whilst I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to add a little bit more colour to this little bit of the shadow colour that we've got left. So if you remember, that was the cobalt along with the orange. I'm not going to introduce any more water, so I'm going to keep my brush quite dry while I get that off there, and make quite a thick mix of the same colour. That's nice and thick to get it a little bit darker under the edge here. Because obviously underneath there you're not really going to be able to get very much light at all. That's just going to help bring the pepper itself out away from the table or whatever it's sat on. And we'll keep that colour in case we need to add more layers later. Some of that orange is still wet, but this bit here has dried. So what I'm going to do is, whilst I'm waiting for that orange to dry, is I'm going to get some of a brighter green. This little cork palette's actually reclaimed corks, you know, used from wine bottles that have been used before, so that's rather nice. And the good thing about it is if you're using it to travel with, if you're taking it out on a walk, because it's cork compared to you know, a thick plastic or something, it's very light to carry. So we've got that green there, and what I'm going to do is pop a tiny touch of red in there, just because I feel that green is a little bit too bright. And that red just makes it a tiny touch more natural. And I'm just going to do some of the detail with the tip of my brush around the stalk here. And a tiny touch of the shadow colour again on the tip of my brush. Nice fine tip to get some of those lines, just to build up a little touch of detail. And then we'll leave that to dry whilst we wait for the rest of the orange to dry. Now that orange is almost dry, I'm going to see about getting some red, and if again I get hold of this. So this is very handy to have, because actually if you look at it, it's quite different. Sorry, it's that way up, actually I've turned it over, but it's easier to see on here what it's going to look like on your paper because it's against that white. So if we look at this, the probably Crimson Lake is going to be the nicest red for us to use on this pepper, and it's a little bit on the blue side. It's quite a cool red, which is what the pepper is really, but then we've got this nice warm yellow underneath. So I don't think we need to add anything to this red. I think we'll just use it as it is. Tiny touch more water and plenty of the red, but we don't want to obliterate all the orange, because actually this pepper is more orange than red, and it's just certain places where it's much more red. So over one side, over this side, it's much more red, and over this side it's much more orange and yellow. And we'll do it a segment at a time. I'm going to bring our brush strokes down in the direction that this pepper's going. making a few lines and gaps to give us that feeling of the way it's moving, the way the flesh is coming across there. Get a nice straight line on that edge and bring that in. So you may wonder what the point was of putting the yellow in and then the orange in, but of course the transparent, so that's all shining through. And like I say, this working wet onto dry, wet onto either dry paper or dry paint, is a very good way to practice watercolour and to get to know how they work, get used to them, familiarise yourself with them, and it'll become easier to use them in time as you go along. And then you can progress on to doing more wet into wet techniques. And that's a lovely colour on top of there, because it's not just as it is here. So can you see the difference in the colour there to the colour there, because of that orange and yellow underneath coming through that transparent colour. You may notice one or two of the pencil lines around here you can still see. And once everything's completely dry after a day, you know, leave it overnight again, you can come along with a nice soft clean eraser and get rid of a few of those pencil lines. Just by leaving those little gaps of colour there, it gives us the feel of more of the shape. And as we come forward, we need a lot less red, it's much more orange and yellow over this side. Apart from down underneath here. To sweep all the way along and at the end there actually. And the red goes up the centre here. And then it's kind of got this line that goes over. That's going to help with the shape. It actually comes straight across the bottom there. So whilst you're painting, you're also continuing to draw. And on this side, the red very much comes down this way. And then the centre here is much more orange. So we'll leave that there. Again, this line comes all the way over here, so it goes around and over. And then we've got this line coming this way. So we can do a little bit of drawing with the colours as well as with the pencil that we did earlier, to help get the feel of the shape. Not too happy with that line there, so if you just get a damp brush, you can just smooth that off a little bit. And before I leave that to dry, there's just a tiny touch of green down here. Which you sometimes get, don't you? Again, I'll just soften that a little bit and then stop fiddling and leave it to dry. Now that that's completely dry, you can see that that red has softened a little bit and more of the orange and yellow are coming through, so it looks more orangey than reddy, and I think the colours are quite nice actually compared to the pepper itself. So, but I do feel here that some of the shape is a little bit wrong. It's a bit too busy with some of those highlights and things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of that orange just on its own, and I'm going to go over some of that. So a little bit of water. And just get the shapes here of some of these. Oops, I've got a hair. Some of these shapes going down. So right over the top. Peppers are in kind of segments, aren't they? So we'll do that segment. And over the top of that green as well, because that's just a touch of green showing through. And I think that's unified that a little bit more. And this area as well. I won't go over all the highlights, but I'm just going to try and make it less busy. I think, oops, made a mess there now. And this is a good thing about having a good tip on your brush. You can make some nice fine straight lines if you need to. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to dry, and then I'm going to come over and put some shadows in. So whilst it's drying, let's have a think about those shadow colours. In some places, I just need to go a little bit deeper with the red. So we'll use the same red again. And keep it nice and thick. A tiny touch of water in there. And plenty of pigment. So that's just really to make the round shapes, give a few little extra shadows. And then we also need to make something a little bit darker. So again, not too much water, and some of that red again. And adding into that some of the cobalt. So that makes a really deep purple. And to make it a tiny bit more natural, we'll add some of the orange, which of course, again, is from the other side of the colour wheel. And you've got a nice deep dark brown made of those colours that we've already got there. So by not introducing any extra colours, it's going to be a little bit more harmonious. Now that's dry, and before I put those shadows on, I'm not overly happy with this little touch of green here. I feel it's a bit dark. So with a brush that's not my best Sable brush, I'm just popping a bit of water on there and lifting a tiny bit of that colour out, and you can see that's there on the tissue, just lifting that out. I just felt it was too dark, and I perhaps should have used one of the lighter greens, maybe that, what was it called, this olive green or the light leaf green. So, and although I've just used a tiny bit of water, that will still be a little bit damp, so we need to leave that area now before we do anything else with it. Just take a tiny bit more out. Okay, so these two shadow colours. So the first one, this red, we're just going to use to make some of those shapes, because obviously we've got the pepper going around in this direction, but then we've got things going over like this and down here, like I say, in those segments, and that's going to cause shadows. So the shadow's going to be towards the inside here, nearest to the centre. So just by putting an extra layer of that red over, that's going to help with that shape. And we're not going to overdo this. Just to get some shape to the pepper. Down here and underneath, obviously, because we're not getting that light under here, so we'll just intensify that red under there to add to that shadow there. Now at this stage you could continue and go on and on, adding layers, seeing where the shadows are, going darker and really building up that shape. But I feel we don't need to do too much more detail on here. And if you've got more time, you may want to do that. Just keep going on, keep making it more realistic perhaps. But for me that's going to be enough with that red. So now I'm going to get this really dark colour and just look at where the really darkest areas are. And they're right next to this centre and where those bumps go off. Making little triangle shapes. And it's only a tiny thing, but it makes all the difference to the detail that we've got here. And a little bit more on that line there. Very fine, just a tiny bit. And again, like we did before, we're just going to put some more under here where it's the darkest. And that's just going to all help make that pepper look as if it sat more on the table. And the final thing I'm going to do to finish off is just pop a little bit of yellow over where I felt that that green was a bit muddy. I've made a bit of a mess there, but never mind. Okay, and that just brings that little shine back to that area. Like I said, it's a very shiny object. Very flat, smooth surface. And then we want to leave that to completely dry. So my first impressions of Viviva colours are really nice. I think they're lovely. The main thing is for me how vibrant they are. Got some very, very rich colours there. Obviously they're transparent, the watercolours, but you can really build up that intensity of colour. I like the fact that this is really light, so it's very transportable. What I would do now is leave this to completely dry before I close it up and pop it back in the sleeve. But of course when I do that, I'll just pop that in so that I've always got that there to refer to. Because like I said earlier, this gives you more of an indication of what your colours are going to look like on the paper than just looking at them on here. So I would always recommend doing that with whatever paints you're using. So the next video I'm going to do using Viviva when I get time will be using the other things that they've sent me. So they've sent me some lovely metallic ones which will be nice in the run up to Christmas, and they've also sent me a travel set, so hopefully I'll get a sunnier day to go out and use that as well. But like I said, this one was the spring set of 16 colours. And I will link that down below in the description, and there's also a code for a discount there, especially for my YouTube followers, so if you would like to use that code for 10% off, you can do. So that's all down below in the description. But yeah, for the first go, I could say I really like these. I like the colours, I like how vibrant they are, and I like how portable they are. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. I'll be back soon with another YouTube tutorial or demonstration. In the meantime, enjoy your painting and drawing. Bye bye for now.